Hi everyone. I'm going to go ahead and make video for chapters 15 and 16 and then a little bit into 17. This might be one of my favorite sections of this book because of just what I've learned about it recently. The wilderness section. So like there's going to be a longer wilderness section later in the book of Numbers, but in Exodus this is the wilderness section. They get out of Egypt, and then usually what people remember is Sinai, um, the Ten Commandments. That's the next big thing people remember. But this section is actually important. It's really important for the purposes of the book, because its bottom line up front is that you'll see a few times in this passage that we read today is that God is testing His people. And a big thing is like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that He's testing? Because this word shows up throughout Scripture, that we are tested by God, and we need to figure out what that means. Bottom line up front is just with the rest of this book. God's concern is making Himself known not only to the people of Israel but ultimately to the world. So He's shown Himself and who He is through the plagues and through the Exodus out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and now He's going to begin testing His people. And the purpose of that testing is to not only show them who He is, but also He's starting to form character in him so that later, when they enter the promised land and when they encounter others, those people will be able to see who God is through His people. That has extremely relevant implications for us as we encounter these tests or hard situations. So that's the bottom line up front. We'll get into it. There's three kind of miraculous happenings. We have the bitter water turns sweet, we have the manna, and then we have water from the rock. In the first two miraculous happenings, God tests the people, but in the third one, the people test God. And that's a turn in the narrative and kind of a warning and a foreshadowing of what's going to happen later. So with the bitter water, they have the bitter water, they can't drink it, they're grumbling, so they throw in the wood and it becomes sweet. It's a miraculous happening. And I think what's really interesting about this is that right after the water is turned sweet, they reach this kind of oasis type place, and you're like, man, they almost made it. Seems like they could have made it, but I think it's significant that God met their need when they were in distress in this miraculous way, right? Like they could have gotten to Elam and been like, okay, we made it, but there would have been less chance, I guess, of them giving credit to God for that. So he showed Himself to them in this miraculous way, to make sure that they know that He is the one that provides for them. So look again at 25b and 26, and you see the word test show up like we just talked about. And now typically to us, testing means like you take a test and kind of like the teacher kind of going to see what you're made of, like, do you really get it? There might be an element of that here. The God is kind of seeing who His people are. What do we got here? Kind of thing. But really, I agree with Peter Enns is the guy we've been using, but also this book, Ross Blackburn, The God Who Makes Himself Known. I think the more of the connotation of the word test here is like training. God is training His people to obey. Obedience, as we're going to see in a few minutes, becomes really important for God making Himself known through His people. So He's trying to instill a lesson in them that He is the one who provides, and they don't have to strive or be worried. And that, as you'll see in Matthew 6 in the New Testament, that's an important part of our witness to the nations, that we can be content, and we can learn to not be anxious. It's hard, but it's one of the lessons here, learning that God provides. And we can also see that hardship is meant to bring a harvest of righteousness and peace for us. And I ask you to consider how the Lord has done that for you in the midst of your hardship. Okay, so the next section is the manna. The manna gets a lot of play in the Bible. It comes up again and again because it's such an important part of Israel. They received manna for 40 years. 40 years in the desert, even after their rebellion and their wandering, and it stops when they get to the promised land. It's all very miraculous. And you can read in the passage, it's kind of clear the intended outcome of the testing. So what I would like to suggest is that this part of the training or the testing is meant to teach them at least three things. It's more than this, but it's at least three things: um, trust, obedience, and contentment. I have you reading through Deuteronomy 8 because Deuteronomy 8 is basically written. Well, not basically; it is written when Israel is on the precipice of entering the Promised Land, 40 years after this. And in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is looking back on what has happened, and he's interpreting it through the Lord. The Lord is interpreting what has happened. And so in Deuteronomy, we get a look at God saying, "This is why the things happen like they did," and the manna and the quail and these things are mentioned. So I'm having you read a part of that section, and I'd like you to consider, how did God teach Israel to trust Him? It was by providing and by giving them kind of what they needed, putting them in this hard place, and yet prospering them in some ways where they wouldn't be expected to prosper. But also we need to consider, okay, well, think about yourself. In what ways is it difficult for you to trust God? That might reveal some of the places where God is kind of like hoping to build something in us. And it's just a good point of recognition, like where are we not trusting the Lord that we need to? I don't have my Bible and point up Deuteronomy 8 here. Just doing this all on the fly. Not good. So the second section of Deuteronomy, I point to, I think this ties to obedience. Observe the commands of the Lord, walking in obedience to Him and revering Him. And it talks about, bringing them into this land of milk and honey. So the basis, this is really important. The basis of Israel's obedience is not demand. Okay. God's not saying, you listen to me because I'm God and you're not. The first thing God does is He brings them out of Egypt. In other words, He gives them what they need. So the grumbling here in the desert, they grumble and they're like, man, we don't have what we need. God doesn't smack them down. He doesn't threaten to destroy them. He says, okay, I'm going to give you what you need. In other words, the foundation of obedience is always grace. And this is important for the gospel. When we mess this up, we mess a lot up. God chose His people. That is the first thing. They are His elect. There is nothing that they did to deserve it. There's nothing that they have brought to the table. They were just God's people, and God was being faithful to His promise, which was also out of nowhere. No merit there either. So I think, therefore, we need to look at where we struggle with obedience and consider, why do I struggle with obedience? Because I think what we'll find is where we struggle with obedience is where we have not kind of let grace saturate our lives. Okay. I also have you going to John 6, where Jesus talks about being the bread of life. And what does it mean that when we talk about, man does not live by bread alone, but by the very word that comes from the mouth of God? What does it mean that Jesus is the bread of life and to kind of eat this bread? Think about the communion and what this is supposed to mean that Jesus is our very life. It means, yes, that He gives us our daily bread. It also means that He in Himself is our daily bread. This is a bit of a mystery, but it just means that He is our sustenance. He gives us life. It's kind of a beautiful image of what it means to be in relationship with God, that He is the one that sustains and uphold us. And finally, I have you looking back at Deuteronomy 4, not to Deuteronomy today, where we can see that obedience is the way that God was bringing the nations to Himself. As the people lived in obedience to God, the nations would take notice and say, like, this God is different from what we worship. And in the same way, the church, we see in the New Testament that obedience to God is crucial for our witness. And so that's why this testing period in the wilderness was important. The people were being made to be the kind of people who could shine a light. And that speaks into our desert trials as well as theirs. The third aspect is contentment. We see discontentment all over the Exodus story, but we see, I'm getting ahead of myself. I have you reading some passages in Philippians, and the two passages are supposed to be kind of juxtaposing people who are discontent, people who are kind of ruled by their passions, and Paul, who is content despite being in prison. And I'd like you to consider which one characterizes you more, contentment or discontent. I think sometimes I'm the latter, to tell you the truth. I feel like I'm always looking towards what's next. I'm always, well, not all, but I'm quick to point out what could be better. And I have a feeling I'm not alone in that. So I'd like you to reflect on that as well with your family group. But what I think is interesting is right after this passage of obedience in Deuteronomy 8, um, the next section has to do with what I would like to call false contentment, where the people have become, like they get into the promised land, they're like, wow, look at all this stuff we had. And rather than saying, isn't God awesome for providing, they say like, aren't I awesome? And we do this so much in our lives. Our society is like the self-made society. The American dream is if you work hard, you can kind of like make a life for yourself. And that is very antithetical to what God is trying to teach his people here, which is that he is the provider and he is the bread of life. I think that often we are tempted to think that way. The next passage focuses a little bit on the Sabbath. The Israelites are going to learn a lot of things from practicing the Sabbath. First, they're going to learn to live a life that imitates the Lord, right? They're following the pattern of what God did in creation. Second, the Sabbath taught Israel that obedience would not come at her expense. That is huge because I think we often think practice the Sabbath means we're going to miss or lose something. And third, they will learn that God would supply for their needs. What I just said about obedience coming at her expense, man, how often do we think like that? And in Mark 2, Jesus talks about how the Sabbath is for us. But how often do we think that being obedient will come at some kind of cost to us? And with the Sabbath, we're like, man, I'm not going to get my work done. I'm not going to be able to do what I want to do. I'm going to be behind this week. We often think of the Sabbath that way, but we have to remember that we are told to prepare, or the Israelites were told to prepare for the Sabbath. They had to gather twice as much on Saturday or whatever, Friday, whatever day it was, and then they had to boil the manna so that it would keep. I mean, there was work to be done to practice the Sabbath, and so that's going to be true for us too. And we need to keep that in mind. So what would it look like for you to practice the Sabbath? This is very countercultural, even in the Christian world. I am not good at practicing Sabbath. I don't do it at all. And so as I read this, it was a challenge for me, as I expect it will be for you. Okay, and finally, water from the rock. I'm just touching on this passage, but please note that Israel tests God in this passage. God kind of lashes out at them because it's not just grumbling. It's like a statement against God. We do that too, I think, when we feel like we don't get what we wanted. Sometimes it's not just, there's a difference between saying like, God, I am destitute here, I'm in need, and coming to God and saying, what is your deal, God? Now, I think that we have to be honest with God about that. But they do say different things about our heart, right? Now, I think what's interesting is that despite the people's faithlessness, God does provide for them. And Paul uses this imagery in 1 Corinthians 10 to say that Jesus is the rock. And again, there's some debate here. But I think that the take-home point is that Jesus always provides for what we need. And that is a warning in and of itself to not run after idols. So Paul's saying, Jesus is the rock, he gives you what you need. So why are you running after idols? That's kind of what he's saying. Those two things go together. So I think the flip side of that is look at your life and where you are running after idols and consider what that means about you think about Jesus's ability to provide for you or Jesus's ability to help you. And what I'd like you to do as you close, sometimes Bible studies can be very, the prayer requests section can be very much like, I have a test and blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But I hope that this will lead you into a place of like, what are you needing right now? Like, what are your deepest needs emotionally, spiritually, physically? And let that lead you into prayer requests. Because I think as we can kind of confess our needs, and we can acknowledge that they are our needs and bring those to God, it will help us to not chase after idols as we come to him with our needs. Okay, and then I have some challenges here to help you kind of experience God's provision. One is to fast. Another is to give something away. Don't just give away like old clothes that you never wear. Give away something that means something to you. I'm really bad at that, y'all. And then finally, I ask you to consider practicing the Sabbath. So as you experience want in these spiritual disciplines, you can also experience God's provision. Okay, that's all I got. I love these passages. Please let me know if you have any questions. See ya.